My memory is faded over the years, and so you'll forgive me if I wrote some things down. Good afternoon, Patriots. How was the barbecue? All right. Welcome to the Patriots Rally for Freedom. I want to start by stealing a line from Ross Perot's running mate, and I want to say, first of all, who am I and why am I here? As Ken said, my name is Jeff, and I decided a while back that what's going on in this country is not okay and that we all have to step up and change it. But I got a better question for you. Who are we and why are we here? I had some ideas on that. We're individuals from across a wide spectrum, but we've gathered together here today because we're concerned about about our country, and we want to discuss ways to fix what's wrong and change what's going on here. We don't agree on everything. We're not in lockstep. We're not mind-numbed robots. We're people who care. Having said that, I think we do probably share some common concerns. For example, our $17 trillion in debt. We're concerned about the NSA spying on our cell phones and our emails. We are concerned about the lack of respect for life and a concentration of power in the federal government and the executive branch. We likely share a concern about Obamacare and cronyism and corruption. And I think there's probably a shared concern about the erosion of our Second Amendment rights. And that final point is what I intend to talk about today. We came here to discuss these and other issues and to seek positive ways to return our government to the core values our country was founded on. Before we talk about those core values, we need to revisit the ideas that form the basis of the American Republic and where they came from. Jefferson famously said in the Declaration of Independence that we have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson did not originate that phrase. John Locke and others wrote about man's natural, inalienable, God-given right to life, liberty, and property. And George Mason had written the concept into the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which reads, that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact, and listen carefully, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, your grandchildren, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So at the core of our government is the idea that each of us has an individual right to life, liberty, and property that is inherent. It is not granted by our government. We are sovereign beings. We own ourselves, and we alone are responsible for ourselves. Each of us not only has an inherent right to our life and family and property, but we have the right to defend those from others who would seek to take them away. Work is hard. Work is unpleasant. And throughout history, some people have sought to avoid that unpleasantness by various means. Some become thieves and steal from others rather than producing their own. Some enslave or bully others and force them to work for their benefit. And murder is as old as the world, as old as Cain and Abel. While it is true that your rights are inherent and cannot be given to you, they can certainly be taken away. You have the right to your life, liberty, and property, but you do not have the right to the life, liberty, and property of another person. The first caveman to go out, venture out of the cave and kill something and drag it back must have encountered another caveman who decided it would be a lot easier to go in and steal whatever it was than to go get his own. The concept is as old as man itself. People are going to try to take away your rights, and you have to defend against that. And you have not only a right, but an obligation to defend your life, your family, your liberty, and your property from those who would take those away. At some point, it took too much of man's precious time to defend himself. If you're a farmer and You can't, and you need to grow crops. You can't just stand around all day defending what you have. You have to go out and produce it. Bastiat wrote, "If every man has a right of defending, even by force, his person, his liberty, and property, a number of men have a right to combine together, to extend, to organize a common force, to provide regularly for this defense. And this is the basis of government." Again, Bastiat writes, "What then is law? It is the collective organization of the individual right of lawful defense. Nothing more." But notice that the rights extended to the collective cannot exceed the rights of the individual that give them that power. The collective cannot infringe on the life, liberty, and property of others because the individual cannot infringe on the life, liberty, and property of others. I think sometimes our government has forgotten that. They have no more rights than we give them. Their rights come from us, not the other way around. After the American Revolution, the founders set up the Articles of Confederation. But as we know, the arrangement did not work out too well. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay began advocating for a stronger federal government that could be more effective. Not everyone was convinced of the wisdom of a stronger federal government, and so they had some convincing to do. They produced a number of articles that we all have come to know as the Federalist Papers. We tend to think of the founders as having a single set of ideas, and we often look to the Federalist Papers to determine their intent, but there was significant disagreement about the idea of a strong federal government, with men like Patrick Henry and George Mason and Brutus and Farmer writing very convincing articles on the other side of the argument, pointing out the dangers of a strong federal government to individual liberty. These articles have come to be known as the Anti-Federalist Papers, and they are equally important to determine the ideas that our country was founded on. And if you haven't read them, you need to. If you haven't read the Federalist Papers, you need to read those too, but there was a strong debate and discourse going on there, and it's not just one-sided. Hamilton seemed to have very little fear of a strong federal government. At one point, he actually suggested that the president should be elected for life. The original Constitution had no Bill of Rights, no recognition of the limitations of government on the inherent rights of men. Patrick Henry and others were having no part of the new Constitution, and in fact, it would never have been passed had the Federalists not compromised and agreed to pass the Bill of Rights immediately after ratification. If one reads back and forth between these groups of men and their lively but reasoned debate, it becomes clear one of the things that was feared was the power of a standing army. They'd just gotten out of a war where a king had been using his standing army to oppress his own people, and they feared that. The idea was that citizens should be armed to prevent their leaders from ever using a standing army to control citizens. At that time, there were no organized police forces, there was no National Guard. There were only the citizens armed in a militia to come together to provide for common defense. And so they clarified the inherent right of self-defense in the Second Amendment by adding an initial clause to it, which explained why it was needed. Quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Unquote. That's it. It's pretty simple and straightforward. And for the first 100 years of its existence, it was almost completely non-controversial. There is nothing in the amendment or in its intent about hunting or clay pigeons or skeet shooting. It's not about target practice. It doesn't mention muskets or swords. It's about our inherent right to defend ourselves, to defend our life, liberty, and property. But over time, the size and scope of the federal government grew, and people decided they knew a little bit more than what their forefathers had. The memory of British tyranny faded. People like Patrick Henry were no longer around to defend these ideas. So the argument was made that the Second Amendment was outdated, and it referred to the National Guard, or that they referred to muskets, or that they didn't understand modern warfare or modern arms. Fortunately, not everyone forgot. Calvin Coolidge famously said, "Liberty is not collective, it is personal. All liberty is individual." And yet for a number of years, gun rights were eroded under the assumption that the Second Amendment was collective until 2008, when the Supreme Court decided in the Heller case that in fact all rights are individual. One would think that would have settled the question, but it was a 5-4 decision. Justice Scalia wrote an impassioned defense of the decision, but there was obviously a dissent, and there are still 4 justices on the Supreme Court that don't agree with that idea. The natural right to defend yourself does not depend upon statistics or public opinions or even Supreme Court decisions, but it should be noted that states and local governments have nevertheless passed very restrictive gun control regulations, effectively banning guns in certain places like Detroit and Chicago. I do not need to point out to you that this has not made these places safer. Detroit has gone bankrupt and crime in Chicago has reached epic proportions. Criminals do not follow laws, and so the evidence is clear that banning guns doesn't stop criminals from possessing or using them. I saw a program this week on Chicago. I think it's called Chicagoland, and it was a heartbreaking program where they followed a school. They're following the police department in Chicago, and there was a young man on there who was trying to do the right thing, but each year 3 or 4 of his friends get shot with handguns because of gang warfare in the city of Chicago. This in a place that has banned those handguns. Those handguns are illegal, and yet it's one of the most dangerous places in our country. Detroit's police chief has recently stated that he would like for the citizens of Detroit, and maybe they're waking up, to arm themselves because the police can't do it. And I think he's right there. I've traveled all over the great state of Texas. I've spent a lot of time in Texas and a lot of time across the border as well. As you know, Mexico is a gun-free zone. And like Chicago and Detroit, you can see how that turned out. Imagine yourself, and I've been there a lot of times, in El Paso looking across at Juarez and thinking to yourself, well, Texas, guns are legal. This must be a dangerous place. I should go over to Juarez where guns are illegal and then I'll be safe. Not. Likewise, if you're in McAllen, Texas, and you're looking at Reynosa, guns are banned on the other side of the border, and yet who among us would rather be over there than over here? We're assembled here to discuss how best to change things in the country we love. I believe that change needs to start with educating the American people. You folks are here, and I think I'm speaking to a friendly audience, but as we know, there are a lot of people who don't believe this way. It's your job to go out and educate. In my opinion, actually, I've never lived in any, in my opinion, I believe that change needs to start with educating the people, and to do so requires that we understand their perspective. We don't have to agree with their perspective, but we have to understand their perspective. I never lived in inner city Chicago, but I'm trying to put myself in the position of somebody who lives there and how they look at guns. Because if I don't understand where they're coming from, when I go out to educate them, I'm not going to be able to convince them of anything. I need to understand where they're coming from, what their objections are, and how I can counter those ideas by educating them on where these rights come from and why they're effective. If you switch from that inner city Chicago to rural Texas, and you look at how guns are viewed down here, many of you were raised up with guns. Your father or your uncle taught you about that rifle, taught you about that shotgun, and by golly, if you pointed it at something that you didn't want to kill, you got an earful, right? You were taught to respect guns. You were taught that guns are used for hunting, guns are used for sport, and guns are used for lawful defense, but guns aren't used to go and take the life, liberty, or property of another people. You were taught to respect them. But let's look at another perspective. Let's think about the suburban housewife, the soccer mom, somebody who lives in suburbia where they don't have the threats that they have in Chicago. They don't have the respect for guns that they have here. Those folks don't understand what this is all about. All they hear about is another school shooting. They hear about the crime in Chicago, and someone tells them that the answer to all that is to ban guns. And they fear that. They fear the gun. They fear the people wielding the gun. They don't know what the answer is, so they sign up for, yeah, let's just ban guns. That'll be a good idea. But let's take another perspective. Let's think about a young father in a place like Syria, Ukraine, Egypt, or even Juarez. Guns in Ukraine are not for sport. Guns in Ukraine are to protect you from your government or to effect change or to defend your liberty. It's something that the soccer mom has forgotten because she hasn't faced that threat or she doesn't see that threat. We see it, but she does not. And sometimes people need to be reminded that the world is not a safe place for somebody in Egypt, in Ukraine, in Syria, in Turkey, in Venezuela, or in Juarez. We forget it here because we have such a wonderful place, but those freedoms are being eroded and we don't remember it. We don't think about it. The founders were very clear that the time will come when the people, and that's us, will need to defend themselves against their government. And that is as true today as it was when they first voiced those fears. One thing I hear a lot from people that really concerns me is the idea that as long as we have our guns, our other rights are intact. And I would like to disabuse you of that notion. The defense of the Second Amendment is absolutely necessary, but it is not sufficient. You are holding in your hands, in your warm, living fingers, your guns, and yet they're taking away your Fourth Amendment rights. They're listening to your emails. They're listening to your phone calls. They're destroying the 10th Amendment. They're destroying the First Amendment. And we sit by with the false sense of security that comes from having our guns. The defense of the Second Amendment is necessary, but not sufficient. Make no mistake, despite the Heller decision, Second Amendment rights are under attack. Most notably is the conflict taking place right now in Connecticut, where letters have been sent out to registered gun owners who have the wrong kind of guns, that they have a limited amount of time to turn in those guns or they will be confiscated. I don't know about you, that frightens me. Our founders, like today's Egyptians and Ukrainians, decided they were not going to stand by and see their liberties eroded. They were, of course, not of one mind any more than the Egyptians are. The Loyalists and Tories did not support the revolution any more than the Muslim Brotherhood supported overthrowing their government. Washington and others ended up having to fire bullets at people who were formerly their neighbors. This is serious business. I'm not suggesting we need to take up arms against our government and fellow countrymen. I realize a lot of people don't agree with me, but I feel that situations like the one in Connecticut may force the issue and make us decide. And of all the good intentions of the world will not defend your rights if you do not have the means. We came here today to discuss the issues we confront and to seek positive solutions to those problems. Although we may at some point need to take up arms to defend our rights, let us hope that's a last resort. I have some alternatives that I'd like to suggest. First, we need to be responsible gun owners. Use them and store them properly and only for sport and lawful defense. Second, teach your children about firearms. Teach them respect. Teach them the proper handling and care and remove their fear. Take the time to understand the perspectives of others and then counter those arguments with rational thought. You know, I'm struck by the tone of the Federalist Papers and the AntiFederalist Papers. Nobody was calling anybody a libtard or names or running them down. They were making cogent arguments, and that's what it takes to change people's minds. Please engage people with respect on this issue. And if you tend to forget why, keep in mind that at some point those people may be like the Loyalists and the Tories, and you may have to take up arms against your countrymen. It's serious business. Finally, 2014 is an election year. Vote. Don't just vote. Get to know the candidates, get to know the issues, and engage in the process. Talk to your neighbors. Talk to the folks that you are friends with. Talk to your family. Let them know what the issues are, who the people are, and get them engaged. The great men of the past were just men. Our founders left us with a great legacy, but they're not here to defend it. Too often when concerns are voiced, I hear people say, well, they would never let that happen. Who are they? Let me suggest to you, there is no they. There is only we. There's not somebody else who's going to take care of this. We are going to take care of this, or it won't be taken care of. We must be the ones to make the tough decisions. We must be the defenders of liberty. Centuries from now, we will be the forefathers that our descendants will read about. History is being written now, and what we do or do not do will be part of that history that your great-grandchildren will teach to their kids. We must have the integrity and the courage to do what is right, to protect our individual liberties for future generations. Our rights can never be given to us. They can be taken away. And if we do not defend them, we will lose them. Those who came before us shed their precious blood to ensure not just their freedom, but ours as well. This is our time. It is our turn to face history. And it starts here and now with me and with you. And I encourage you to do the right thing. Thank you, and God bless.